My name's Ed Piskor.
I'm Jim Rugg.
Special guest in the house today, Jim. Miss Ann Nocenti, great Marvel editor, writer. Chris Claremont always credits her as being an important part of the puzzle when writing his X-Men comics. She helped create the very first Art Adams comics, wrote the first Jim Lee X-Men story in the back of classic X-Men. Jimmy, what am I leaving on the table, man?
The classic Daredevil run with John Romita Jr. and Al Williamson, one of my favorite runs of any superhero comics. I'm so excited to dig into this.
So from the start, how did you even get into the Marvel offices? Because I do remember reading you talk about like not even really being that much of a comics person growing up or anything like that.
Yeah, I was definitely. I had an imposter syndrome for the first long while because I wasn't a comic reader. I didn't know anything about comics. Back then, there was a newspaper called The Village Voice, and you looked in The Village Voice to get an apartment and a job, and answered an ad for editorial something, and it turned out to be Marvel Comics.
Did you find out it was Marvel Comics in conversation on the phone, or you stopped into the office?
Back then they had this thing called a personnel office, and it was Dorothy was her name. And I remember she was like a really sweet elderly lady, and she was very discreet and demure and didn't really want to quite tell me that much about the job. And I got up there, and the other thing back then, we're talking, I was just fresh out of college, like 20 years old, or however old I was. There were temp agencies. This would have been like 1980. So you'd sign up with a temp agency, and they would send you on gigs. And I had a portfolio of artwork because I was a painter and a sculptor, and I did etchings, zinc plate etchings. And I came to New York wanting to be an artist. And I went on all these art director, graphic designer type, get your foot in the doorway. I worked at Gray Advertising. I did back then you did a lot of what's called paste up and mechanicals.
Right.
It just was kind of I would say that it was almost like I was trying to find a place where my personality matched the company's. And I was having a hard time with that because a lot of the ad agencies back then were very slick and formal and kind of stifling. They didn't feel that creative. And so then when I walked into Marvel Comics, I think it was kind of like, my feeling was, yeah, I feel at home here,
Did you begin as an assistant with Larry Hama? Is that
No,
correct?
I was Jim Shooter's assistant, and back then I was just a secretary. They didn't even call you an assistant. I guess I was Jim's assistant editor, but back then they called you a secretary. And I didn't last long at the secretary position because I kind of made sure I wasn't that good at it, if you know what I mean. It's like, okay, I'll type up your letters. And, Jim was a good letter writer. They were always short and punchy and to the point. And, I kind of got to know a lot of the backroom secret dealings of Marvel because the secretary knows everything. You're typing up all the letters. And so Denny O'Neil was really my first mentor. And he gave me my first story to write. It was a bizarre adventure story. I still didn't really understand what a comic book was, and wasn't that comfortable with the whole idea of a superpower, So I made his power luck, and it was a short story for Bizarre Adventures about a guy who was so lucky, and of course he went to a gambling den and made a lot of money, and then fell apart. And then So Denny really, and Denny in many, many ways. And, you know, I'm going to raise my glass to Denny because
Rest in
he
peace.
just recently passed. And I went to see Denny this past winter, and he was so funny and sharp, but discombobulated. You could tell he was having some trouble. And then I wanted to go see him again, and then you know what hit, you know, the lockdown. So I couldn't see Denny again. And anyway, Denny was the man. I was kind of a wannabe journalist. I wanted to, you know, be a reporter. It was kind of one of my dreams. And Denny was the perfect guy to meet in comics if you wanted to do a bit of like street reporting and put it right in your comics. So Denny was a big influence on me.
How close did you work with Denny O'Neil, and sort of for how long before you grew your own wings and started to do your thing?
I was 10 years, about 8, 9, 10, I forget how long. The whole 80s, I think of the 80s as being at Marvel Comics. And so everybody was there, so you could wander. Denny and I used to go to lunch or go out after work, or you just wander into each other's offices all day long. So you had like the mentorship of Marvel Comics was not a formal thing. It was just kind of, you were there, you didn't know what you were doing. Sometimes people noticed that I was there and didn't know what I was doing. You know, I had huge imposter syndrome. I had no right to be there, you know. So you had, you know, Mark Grunwald and Mike Carlin and Louise Simonson and Larry Hama, Al Milgram, everybody that knew what they were doing kind of taught me little things, you know, all day long. Like, you know, and then they'd be annoyed and go off and do their jobs. But you kind of just learn by osmosis. And then after Denny, I wrote a story for Denny, and then a lot of the editors came in to, I guess I was working still with Jim Shooter. I can't really remember. I wasn't with Jim long. I moved on to Al Milgram, Carl Potts, Louise Simonson. I mean, Louise Simonson basically taught me everything. Everything I know was from Wheezy in terms of editorial. And so then some editors came in and said, oh, we read this story that Denny gave you to do, and would you do this? Would you do that? So it's very, very happenstance.
Do you remember much about writing that first story? Did you do it in a Marvel method of like, kind of here's the plot and let the artist break it down into panels? Because that seems like a strange step for someone that's not has a lot of comics background.
Well, I was in college, besides being a painter, so I already thought in pictures, because I was basically that's all I did was paint and draw and make things. But I was a film student too, and I was very impacted by 70s filmmaking. So you're talking high school and college was in the 70s, and that's when my mind exploded with like all the independent film, the Ukaida cinema, Godard, Kurosawa, you know, I mean, on it, Coppola, on and on. And so I think I brought a film sensibility and an art sensibility. So I already thought in pictures and angles and shots. And I never saved anything, so I don't really know what my plots look like, but I'm pretty sure they would have been some kind of hybrid, because I never understood how you could draw the expression on someone's face if you didn't know what they were saying. And so what I would do is I would write a plot, but put most of the dialogue in there. And then I always did these little thumbnails myself. Like, I didn't start doing the thumbnails until like a little bit later, like maybe Daredevil. just so I would say, okay, because I think with Art Adams, poor Art Adams, you know, I tortured him with 12 panel pages, you know, and that was back when I started to, because you know, you're so excited, you're young, you're like, it's more like, you know, we were in a garage band or something, and Art would send me drawings and he was super enthusiastic, and I'd send him ideas, and just became this like crazy, you know, like more like playing music almost. And I put too much in the plots. I mean, the plots were just way too dense. And after that, I started doing thumbnails just for myself. Like, can I tell this story in 6 panels? And then I would do the thumbnail. I'd never show them to the artist, and then get back and go, oh, that's much better, you know?
Who was the artist on that first strip? Do you remember?
His name was Greg. That was a long time ago. I want to say like Greg was there or some Greg Larocque. Greg, I think something like that. I can't remember. You'd have to Wikipedia me.
Sure.
You mentioned you know, working with Art Adams. How do you first connect with him?
I think he had sent samples in, and you know, it's like when you're a new, I mean, again, I was an imposter. I didn't know what I was doing. And I think, and I did my first, Louise Simonson was like, you know, you should do your own comic, you know? So I wrote this thing, Long Shot, and I have a feeling it probably was, you know, as fat as a telephone book. It was like a ridiculous Bible of like every aspect of this multiverse world and this, you know, and, you know, I wasn't aware of it back then, but years later, Arthur, I think, said, yeah, I think Wheezy sent your pitch to every artist in the industry, and they all said no. And then Arthur said yes, you know. So he had sent some samples in, and I remember Wheezy and I looking at the samples, and it was the X-Men, but the X-Men doing the dishes or something, you know, because when you're an editor at Marvel and you're always looking for new talent and new artists, a lot of the art samples that come in will be just like a power shot and a fight scene. And you know what our editors really want to know is that you can have Spider-Man swing in from outer space and answer the telephone and then hide his like dirty laundry so Aunt May, you know, you want to see mundane storytelling contrasted with obviously the musculature that you need for superheroes. And Arthur showed us that by having the X-Men wash the dishes. So I think it was like Beast was spinning plates and washing one with his foot and shooting it over to, you know, so it was like they were endearing. They showed so much personality. They showed that he could make a mundane scene exciting. And, you know, Weezy and I were just like in love and just said, so, you know, and then of course, Chris Claremont was right there in the corner going, I want him, you know? So that's what ended up happening was Arthur ended up doing a lot of work with Chris Claremont.
During those years when you were able to see these submissions, can you, off the top of your head, name some of the other heavy hitter superstar artist samples that might have come through from out of nowhere?
There's a lot of, I mean, we had a couple things. When I was working with Al Milgrom, we had Marvel Fanfare. And Marvel Fanfare was it was an amazing place to try out artists and also to put artists if they didn't have work. Like, you know, sometimes you wouldn't have any work and they'd be like, oh, get somebody to write them a Marvel fan, you know, and that was the point of anthologies was to try out new characters that might have, and new talent. I mean, I'll never forget, like Barry Windsor Smith did this Hulk story that was genius. That I don't even know what happened to it.
It turned into something else. I think Marvel didn't publish it for some reason, and it's turned into a book that's coming out next year from Fantagraphics.
Really?
It's
Really?
like 300 plus pages. I think it's called Monster or Monsters, but I think the gem of the idea goes back to that Hulk story.
I am so happy to hear that, because that story, that was a treasure. And I know why Marvel didn't publish it. It was, it was a genius story. It was kind of like, I want to say there was a dinner table is what I remember. And it was like the Hulk's parents, and the Hulk kept switching between being a little boy and a Hulk. And you were kind of looking at the emotional origins of a little kid, and his parents would fight all the time violently, and the language was extremely abusive, with lots of fuck you, fuck you, fuck you. And I remember Al Milgrom and I thought this thing was genius, and there was one thing we couldn't do. We couldn't publish it with all the fuck you, you bitch, you whore, whatever it was. And then I don't remember who, me and Al probably talked to Barry and said, this is still Marvel Comics. We can't break that wall of, me at the time, I probably would have said, go for it, put a sticker on it, read at your own risk or something. A trigger alert, but nobody used that word back then. But, basically, Barry thought that not being able to use that incredibly powerful language would not give you the point of what this little kid was going through. And memory is treacherous. I'm trying to recall something that I haven't thought about for 30 years, but I'm pretty sure that's how it went down. It became like this thing of Marvel asking him, change the language, use son of a blank and use lots of little, and he decided not to do that. That's the only reason it wasn't published, because it was that code thing. We still had the stupid code. The code was like ridiculous. And one day the code rejected something, and somebody said, well, why don't we just take the code seal off the damn thing? And then I think it broke some kind of, wall where everyone went, why are we talking to the code anymore?
I wonder if that Barry Windsor Smith story was around 86, because I feel like that would be such an amazing competitor against like a Watchmen and a Dark Knight Returns.
Yeah, it would have been. It was genius. It would have been phenomenal. I was just so. Nobody had done anything like it, really. The idea that the Hulk. You go back to the childhood dynamics of the kitchen table, and I felt like it was maybe autobiographical. I didn't know, in terms of Barry's, sensibility, because, he's amazing. We did a Daredevil story together, and Barry is who, when I was working with Chris in the X-Men, it's Chris wanted to do like My Dinner with Andre in a comic book. He wanted to do an issue of the X-Men where all they did was talk, and that's where we did a Storm and Forge story, and it was because of Barry, because we knew Barry had the gravitas or whatever to pull off a story without a big fight scene, But that drawer, that Marvel Fanfare drawer, was full of there was also Bernie Wrightson had done I think it was also a Hulk story, and Hulk is chasing a field of rabbits. Does this strike anything? Somebody out there will go, oh yeah. It was like Looney Tunes. It was I think it was also a Hulk story. Barry also had done a Thing story, so I know that there was a Thing story where his rocks were falling apart. He was losing his rocks, literally. Yes. Going off his rocks. But then there was this incredible, it was like a Looney Tunes cartoon, Bernie Wrightson, and it was I think it was the Hulk chasing all these bunnies. Somewhere I have a Xerox of a page of that. But so the Marvel Fanfare drawer was full of treasures that never saw print.
Was the first big project Long Shot, or did the Daredevil happen before that?
I think it was long. I mean, I guess you'd have to check. You got to understand that was 30 years ago.
Sure.
Kind of a blur. But, you know, and also the 80s was like, you know, I was living in Soho with my boyfriend. We had an entire empty building on Wooster Street. The 80s was like, the East Village was exploding with performance art. Any given night, you could go over there and see some kind of crazy art show, crazy performance art. My boyfriend was an artist, and you know, we would just drive our truck around the city and go see amazing acts. You're talking like, you know, it's back when like Steve Buscemi and Mark Boone Jr. would just like set up on a bench with a chessboard and riff and tell jokes, and then you'd go across the street to the Pyramid Club, and there'd be John Kelly doing his Cabinet of Dr. Kilgary, and you know, there was like an amazing graffiti art was everywhere. I mean, New York City was like wild and fun, and so a lot of my influences in comics were from the streets of New York City in the 80s, and that mostly ended up in Daredevil.
Were you the editor at New Mutants when Bill Sienkiewicz took over the art?
Yeah, no, we that was a thing. In fact, that was like one of the low and high points of my career. It was because Chris was writing, you know, there's a blur there because I was Louise Simonson's assistant, and then she left and I became the editor and took over all of the books Chris was working on. So, you know, sometimes I get confused as to which books when I was just the assistant and then editor. But, you know, Weezy taught me everything about how to work with Chris Claremont, because Chris just was a fount of a billion great ideas, and you just sort of, you had to feed him. So you had to go out to lunch a lot. And then we would all just sit there with notebooks, and he would just rattle on, and I would just take notes like, you know, okay, like who's boring? Who haven't we played with lately? Oh, what about this, you know, Ileana character? Oh, gee, maybe we should like take her soul away from her. She's too nice. Let's take her soul away from her. Let's send her to hell. Who would rescue her? You know, so you'd just be riffing on all this stuff and do these like crazy charts and figure out what stories went where. This went in the X-Men, this went in New Mutants, then we had all the miniseries stuff happening then. And so we had this problem. We had the New Mutants, which was a kind of a fun book that felt like it was for younger kids, but at the same time, we felt like it could be hipper, you know? And I love Sal Buscema, I forget how to say it, he's amazing. He kept all my books on time. You know, he did, what did he do for me? Micronauts. He did a whole lot of books for me, and he's a genius storyteller. But I felt like the New Mutants could be something a little edgier, and then Bill was getting off of Moon Knight. He was kind of sick, you know, he was kind of like doing the elongated Neil Adams thing and kind of wanting to find his own. And Bill and I used to spend a lot of time talking about like Hunter Thompson's books, you know, with Ralph Steadman and the Whirligig Eyes. And he was like so excited by what Ralph Steadman did and thought that he could apply that to comics, and Bob Peak and all these different influences that he had. And so I think, you know, I don't remember how it happened. It could have been like Weezy, me, Bill, and Chris just getting an evil gleam in our eyes that Bill should be on the New Mutants. And then I had to make that call and fire Sal. And it was just horrible because Sal, you know, I'm a pretty blunt and honest human. So I probably told Sal, you know, we're looking to step the book up to something a little younger and edgier. And I put him on the Hulk. It's not like he lost work. I put him on the Hulk. And I remember that first issue he turned in of the Hulk after that was magnificent, because he was like, I'll show her, and he like did this great issue of the Hulk. But then in the meantime, then, Bill we realized when Bill's pages for the New Mutants came in, we realized he could do anything. And we were like, Warlock, Legion, Demon Bear. It was like any things that were too abstract, really, to give to just any artist, you could give to Bill. I mean, you could say to Bill, scrap a paper man, and he'd come up with, so I think it was just, and then there was a certain amount of fighting with Jim Shooter, because he didn't think the storytelling was good. It was too crazy. It was too wild. The covers Bill was turning in were like abstract paintings sometimes. And I mean, to give Shooter credit, he sort of did his job by trying to scare me into behaving a little bit. But at the same time, it was a little bit wink, wink, nudge, nudge. Let's see where this goes. This is obviously creative, So we pulled it off, and then Bill became frustrated by wanting to write his own stories, and I think that's when he went off and did Straight Toasters, or maybe Electro was between there.
Did you have a sense of how fans responded to his work? I came to that stuff later, like in back issues, but I'm always curious what impact this kind of stuff that really seems different, what impact that has at the time that it comes out.
Again, back then we're talking pre-internet, remember? So we would get letters, and, there was the mailman, James Gavin, I think his name was. He was the guy would bring the cart around, and suddenly you'd get like a monster pile of mail. And I'd be like, oh boy, lots of mail for the New Mutants, And some people hated it, I have to say. Some people just said, what the hell? Because you're asking people to expand their eyes. And, Bill was pretty radical in terms of making people expand the way they saw. I mean, you could see tons of expansive stuff in underground comics, but not in a Marvel mainstream superhero comic, so it's not like that stuff wasn't out there. I mean, for sure he was influenced by Ralph Steadman, and underground comics for years have been expanding the way we think it, but not mainstream Marvel. So a lot of fans really didn't like it, and then others recognized that they were being taken on a ride that was fun. So you had to ease into it. And I think it's like today when fans get upset because this or that changes, I think if they just change the way they looked at things and went, well, let me take this ride. It's a little different, but let me just go on the ride and stay open, instead of like, that's not the Batman I know, it's like, that's sort of silly.
And this is definitely reflected in the letters pages in some of those New Mutants issues. And,
oh, really? So maybe we were honest and printed the bad ones.
we'll call it a fair picture, probably, because I'm sure there were good ones. But of course, we only remember the adjective-full bad ones.
Well, I mean, we were pretty. There was, pretty much a sense that you printed good and bad letters in the letters column. You wanted to keep that tension up between and discussion of comics. You didn't want it to just be, all the good letters. And in some ways, the bad letters were more fun. So, I remember always I don't know if we printed it or not, but I remember I did an issue of, I put Captain America and Daredevil or something, and I got all these letters, get the commie off the book. And I wanted to print those. I don't know.
Were you there when people were burning effigies of Jim Shooter? Literally?
Yeah, I remember that. Yeah, that stuff. Yeah, I remember that stuff. Look, the place was crazy. The place was really insane. You know, you're talking pre-internet. You're talking like guns in the office, whiskey in the bottom drawer. You know, you're talking like cuckoo times. It's the 80s.
Who had the guns?
So, you know, Marie Severin famously had it.
That's awesome.
And, you know, the Marvel bullpen was like, you'd wander out there. Like, basically, the workload was so intense. I mean, you had to put out like 8-10 books a month. And, you know, that was a hell of a lot of work. And so you'd stay locked in your office, like reading scripts, going over layouts, color, everything. And then, you know, you'd wander out into the bullpen and there would be like all the hooligans, you know, there would be Marie Severin, who I had this, like, I was so intimidated by her because she was so smart and sassy, but I, you know, was enamored of her, and I would go over and like try and hang with Marie. And Marie and I ended up doing the caricature of me. Larry Hama, I mean, that's a funny story. You know, I wasn't a tough girl, and some of the editors up there thought that some of the freelancers were taking advantage of me somehow. I don't know. I was giving them too much time on their deadlines or something. And so Larry Hama made a little caricature of me, like I was like a bug-eyed, you know, Lulu or something. And he put it on a doormat, and he put the doormat in front of my door, and it was like a way of saying, it was Larry's way of saying, they're stepping all over you, you know, get tough. Because Larry was in the next office with like the most guns, you know, anyone had, and knives and swords. And, you know, and so then Marie Severin, she just went nuts with that. And she did all these drawings of me. Some of them went into the comics. And then we eventually did a Toxic Avenger together, which was one of my favorite comics I've ever done. No one's ever heard of it. It sold no copies. But it was Marie Severin and I doing a feminist version of Toxic Avenger.
That's awesome. That's going to be the Kayfabe Effect book from this interview, I think. That's the one I'm going to track down.
Well, you know, we just sort of like, well, what was his Toxic Avenger had a girlfriend, I forget her name, like Moxie or something, and it was like, why is she never the hero? So Marie and I would like sit in a corner and giggle, and we would like came up with this idea that one day she went into her kitchen and she took all her pots and pans and she made them into her, you know, armor, and she went out and she took charge. And it's like it's sort of very unfeminist, feminist, anti-feminist. It's like it's a mess, but it's fun. And I loved working with Marie. And then you had George Rousseau, very done colors, Jack Morelli doing letters in the bullpen, Rick Parker, Jack Abel, who is like, was one of the people I adored. You know, Jack basically just wanted to cut up and make jokes all day and try not to work. Mori Kuramoto, I forget his name exactly. He was like one of the bullpen guys, and you'd go over to him and he'd squeeze your fingernails and look at the color, and then he'd feel the heat on the top of your head, and he would go, carrots, go get some carrots and eat them. And I'd be like, okay, Maury, you know. So everybody had this like loopy personalities, and in the bullpen. And, you know, then there were Ramita's Raiders. Of course, there's Virginia Ramita was like the dominatrix of the whole place. You know, she walked up and down the halls and cracked the whip over everyone to get their. We wouldn't have, Marvel Comics wouldn't have gotten any books out in the 80s if it wasn't for Virginia Ramita. You know, she darkened your door and you quaked, you know, like, yeah, I'll get it done. Just should stand in the door and look at you, you know.
Were you going to school while writing and editing comics as well?
No, I was taking like some kind of community college type. I was taking some journalism classes while I was at Marvel, and then at the very end of my time at Marvel, I I went back to Columbia to get my taking journalism classes, and so yeah, no, I had a full life. That's for sure. Yeah, school, Marvel, and nightlife.
Did editing help you, do you think, as a writer of comics? Did it give you some insights that maybe a regular writer wouldn't have, or access to artists that maybe, you know, a writer wouldn't have access to?
I mean, I don't think that so much as because the 80s were very different. It's like anybody could walk in the door at Marvel. Writers, artists, anybody could walk in with their portfolio and somebody look at their portfolio, and we always had too much work and not enough talent. So I don't think it was so difficult to get work, you know, and I think what I learned was the big difference between being a freelancer and being on staff, because then I became a freelancer, and then in the 90s I was in film and magazine work almost. You know, I left comics and I had a film magazine called Scenario, and I was a screenwriter, getting work as a screenwriter. And one of the things you learn is that when you're a freelancer, you go through all kinds of weird emotional stuff that has to do with getting like paranoid, and you know, and whereas when you're on staff is so full of activity and the general shenanigans of being in an office place, and everyone's busy and there's a stack of stuff and you're like, I'll get to that next week. Meanwhile, the freelancer is sitting home thinking, they hate me, you know. So I think it was more an emotional thing of learning the difference between, you know, how busy and crazy the workplace is, and then as a freelancer, just don't take it personally if somebody doesn't call you back right away, because they're probably just swamped. So I think that was the big thing that I learned, how to be both, how to be a freelancer and an editor.
And were you both in tandem working as a freelance writer and editor, like while doing, say, Daredevil and those projects?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think the more I wrote, the more I wanted to leave and be a freelancer. I don't really remember. I think I was still writing Daredevil after I left. I can't actually remember. And then I did a bunch of freelance stuff, but I'd always wanted to do journalism and screenwriting, and then I just got sucked off into that world for a decade. You know, I was an editor on, I had Covert Action, Lives of Our Times, which was like chronicled the lies of the New York Times and the CIA. And then from there I went to Prison Life magazine, I think, which was, been thinking about Prison Life magazine actually lately, because so many of it was a magazine that was written by and for prisoners. And I keep thinking, and now that we're all on either the two kinds of stories that we get would be about being in solitary confinement, which a lot of us are, or being annoyed by your cellmates. Like, I remember this one story, Radio Wars, and it was all about how, like, I don't want to listen to his music. I want to listen, you know, so it's sort of like now we could bring back Prison Life and everyone would kind of feel it, you know, because of solitary confinement, lockdown, being annoyed by your pod mates, you know. And then from there, I think I got Scenario magazine, and I was the editor of a film magazine for many years. And that was kind of my dream. I got to interview Polanski, Coppola, you know, Christopher Nolan, Darren Aronofsky, you know, Alexander Payne. And I think I learned, that was great training for comics, because a lot of what I was doing was interviewing screenwriters and directors about what changes from the script to the shooting to the editing, and each wave of filmmaking is all basically writing. It's all rewriting. The director's rewriting, the editor's rewriting. And so And I think that's the kind of knowledge that I brought to the work that I'm doing now, which is the seeds in Ruby Falls for Karen Berger at Dark Horse, came from, you know, working in film, and I made a bunch of films too. So I don't know. What are we talking about?
When you were editing these magazines, at any point would you incorporate comics into the mixture? Hire freelancers to do that stuff?
Yeah, because it's funny, when I was the editor of Scenario, I used to I had my, like, back then pre-internet, you had Rolodexes, you know? So I had like my Marvel Comics Rolodex that was full of, like, you know, Steve Ditko, you know, Stan Lee, you know? And then I had my film Rolodex that was filled with all the greats in film. And I would often go to the comics Rolodex and hire comic people, because my magazine was illustrated. So I hired like Kent Williams and Dave McKean and George Pratt. You know, I would try and bring comic people into the film magazine. And then I edited High Times magazine for a year, and I started this centerfold thing that was High Times Comics. And I had Twingley, you know, John Twingley's work, and Farrell, Darrell Rumpel, and John Twingley. Yeah, these were like great comic artists that would do comics in High Times. And so I always tried to keep the comic people in, you know, I'd hire them to illustrate. Or did that answer your question?
Yes, and I remember seeing some pull quotes from you on Farrell's Pop Gun War book.
Oh, yeah.
How did you discover his work? Did you have some affiliation with SVA or something like that?
No, I think he just sent me a comic and said, you know, like, I get comics, people, and they like, if you like it, would you blurb it? It's like the blurb thing, you know? And when you're too busy and you can't deal with it, but, you know, I think I was just enchanted by his work. I loved it. So I wrote a blurb, and I think I wrote an intro maybe for one of the volumes. And then I hired him to do a strip, because I always loved strips. I mean, the comics that I read were Pogo and Dick Tracy when I was a kid. It was like Pogo, Crazy Cat, Dick Tracy. I mean, to me, these were the great comics. And so I always liked the idea of the comic strip as opposed to the comic. So that was the idea. I didn't last at High Times very long, but that was the idea, was to bring back the idea of a great strip.
You mentioned your example with your Rolodex. You mentioned Steve Ditko. Did you have interactions with Steve Ditko? Do you have any stories about him?
We did a comic together. Ralph Macchio, who was my editor at Daredevil, Steve used to sit in Ralph's office, and I got to know Steve a little bit through just hanging around the bullpen. You know, he would talk for hours, you know, never about comics that I remember. He wanted to talk about consciousness and being and politics. And, you know, it's interesting. You look back at those days, and honestly, the idea that I didn't spend more time with all these amazing talents that came in and out of but we were busy. You know, it wasn't easy to put out 8-10 comics a month. I mean, it was often like, shut the door, because I got to get a comic out, until you shut the door on Steve Ditko. You know? But sometimes what would happen is somebody just was working on a comic, and then we're waiting for something else to happen. I want to say maybe Steve was working on his Anarchy book, maybe A is for Anarchy or something like that. And he just needed cash. He needed something. And Ralph was like, Annie, go off with Steve and give him a fill-in, you know, write a fill-in for him. And Again, a lot of this is from naivete. I didn't read comics. Of course, I knew who he was, but I wasn't like, you know, that understanding that I was like, you know, plotting with a legend. And I'm pretty sure, again, memory is like so hard, but I'm pretty sure Steve had an idea about a bunch of people wandering around New York with shopping bags, and you didn't know whether there was a bomb in one of them. There was like a baby in one and a bomb in another or something. And I thought, okay, you know, when you think about it, this is the 80s. This is way before like terrorism, knapsacks with bombs in them, you know. So yeah, so we did a Daredevil, and he wanted to draw the owl, I think.
You also mentioned Karen Berger a couple minutes ago.
Oh, yeah.
And you had done some Vertigo work, I guess, in the early 90s, 93,
Yeah.
94, something like that. And then now you've come back and you're working with her again. Any stories about Karen Berger? I mean, what's it like? You know, do you bring your own ideas as an editor to this experience? Because I think of her as one of these very well-known, important editors. And I'm curious from your perspective, what it's like working with her.
Well, it's funny. We always thought of each, you know, I was at Marvel, she was at DC, and, you know, she was in the industry before me, I think. And we kind of, we didn't really know each other well back then. But I think that when I did Kid Eternity, that was kind of like, what if you could do whatever the hell you wanted in comics, you know? Like Barry Windsor Smith in his Hulk story needed a Karen Berger, really. You know, somebody who just said he needed Vertigo. Somebody who just said, yeah, do whatever you want, swear all you want, break all the rules, you know. In hindsight, I should have just sent Barry over to Karen. But so, you know, her office she has this amazing ability to just throw talent together and let them do whatever the hell they want. And if it soars, fine. If it sinks, fine. A lot of it was like indie bands. You know, you might have had like 3 fans, but you rocked out. You know, it's like, so it wasn't like. I think the Kid Eternity I did with Sean Phillips probably had 2 fans, but they were really intense fans, you know, who claimed the book changed their brain, and everyone else said they're crazy, you know. So, you know, Karen is like, she's what the industry needs more Karen Bergers, because she just says, you know, open the doors wide, let other genres do genre mashups, do, you know. I think that one of the problems with superheroes is because, I mean, I always had a problem with them because you have to escalate to a fight. You know, and my comics, the fights were always the biggest problems. Like, I don't really want to fight, you know. I want to, like, peace negotiate. So, you know, and I even, like, I took karate and judo, and I was like, let's see what this fighting thing is like. And then, you know, I got socked in the jaw once in the ring and went, yeah, I don't like this, you know. But so it's like, why does everything, they're heroes, yet everything escalates to a fight. And so it was always like this tumor on the story narrative. Like, you build a story narrative, you have themes, you know, for me, it was a lot of like journalistic influences from the streets of New York, especially in Daredevil, but then they had to fight. And, you know, I think that then when the IP got so valuable, with the films becoming like, you know, multi-million-dollar, billion, whatever, they don't mess with them enough anymore. They don't mess with the superheroes enough anymore. They should just say, you know, like, because you get these notes when you're doing a superhero now, oh, so-and-so wouldn't say that, or that's off model is one of the things you get, off model. And you're like, well, yeah, we should be doing off-model superheroes to throw the gates open again, to be creative again, you know. So Karen, you know, when she started, so David Aja is a artist. He did Hawkeye. Do you know his work?
Yes.
So David and I had done a Daredevil story, and over the years we were just kind of like, we'd email each other once in a while, and and one day he sent me an email, you know, what are you working on? And I sent him a bunch of stuff, like crazy ideas as usual, and it was kind of about I had this idea that I wanted to do, because I spent many years as a journalist in a lot of different bullpens, and I had reached the conclusion that there's no such thing as the truth. You know, it's like, forget about truth, forget everything is, you know. And as a journalist and filmmaker, you know, you're pulling different facts and putting them together as you want to. And, you know, so I had this idea that we would do like a 1950s style tabloid where we'd have these hoax hunters, like just put it right out front that it's all fake and all news is fake. And there would be like aliens and, you know, Bigfoots and all that kind of stuff. And she'd be like a hard-bitten reporter, you know, and past truth. And then this was, you know, Obama was president. And then the whole fake news scandal happened and Trump became president. And I think what happened was David and I realized that Scoop, it was called, would be seen as a commentary on fake news, when in fact it wasn't at all. It was sort of dreamed up before that. And so we just tanked it and got depressed. Like, this is a dead thing. And then eventually we started saying, well, we kind of like the alien human love story. And there was this sort of idea of what if there was a zone where you could go and throw away all tech and live without surveillance. And so I redid the pitch, and then David called one day and he said, Karen Berger started an imprint. And I was like, well, I sent her the old, you know, she didn't want the old one. No, you know, she doesn't want us. And he was like, send it, you know. And I sent it and she took it. So she's amazing. I mean, she just is very like a Zen master in terms of like keeping you happy and creative and just shaping, you know, shaping the project a bit, but knowing how to get out of your way and just like you. So that became the seeds. The comic became the seeds.
We'll talk to a lot of artists and writers, sometimes on the channel, sometimes at conventions, you know, at dinner or whatever. And everybody has a story where they got one over on their immediate editor, where it's like, you know, the editor wanted this panel redrawn or something. So I just, you know, sat home for the weekend, played some video games, showed them the same pages, and they were like, okay, yeah, that's awesome. You know, making no amendments. You worked as editor and as freelancer. So I have two questions. One, did you ever catch anyone on their bullshit when you told them to change something and they tried to pull a swerve? And two, as a freelance writer, what are some tricks to make sure that you can work around to get your ideas on the page?
All right, I have answers for both of those. Well, I think one of them gets back to Denny O'Neil. I'm pretty sure it was either Denny O'Neil or Archie Goodwin, one of those geniuses, said something like, you always put a yellow bow tie on a cat. And I was like, what? And they're like, well, yeah, you turn in your script and then you write something like, it was, you know, it was a metaphor or whatever, something like the cat with the yellow bow tie across the room. And what you do is you're putting something in your plot so that the editor can feel like they're doing their job by saying, a cat wouldn't have a yellow bow tie. And then you as the freelancer would go, oh, genius editor, you're right. You know, let me get rid of that. Thank you. So that was a trick learned from, I want to say Denny O'Neil, but it might have been Archie Goodwin. And sorry, that's beeping. And then one time a freelancer pulled one over on me, and it was Jim Owsley, who later changed his name to Christopher Priest, I think. So, and honestly, it not only escaped me, but it escaped me for years and years. And then some fan came up to me at a convention and went, you know, you're the only editor in history that ever let Spider-Man kill someone. And I went, I wouldn't do that. Spider-Man would never kill anyone. No, it wasn't me. I didn't do that. And then they pulled out this Spider-Man comic by Jim Owsley. And sure enough, Spider-Man punches an old lady in the head and kills her. How did I let that go through?
Wow.
Talk about off model, you know? And I mean, I can almost feel, I love Jim Owsley was awesome. I mean, he was hilarious. He was like, you know, he still is. I haven't seen him in years. But I can just feel him telling me, well, yeah, it builds up to a point and he's punch drunk and he doesn't know what he's doing and he hears something, he spins around and he talked me into it. You know, he talked me into it. And now I go down in history as the only editor ever to let Spider-Man kill someone.
And it was an old lady.
And it was an old lady, and he punched her right in the face. So that was Jim Owsley. You got to get his side of the story because he'll probably be like, well, Denny O'Neil told me always put a bow tie on a cat. And, you know, I thought, you know, Ann Nocenti, she's a chump, you know. She doesn't know what she's doing. You know, I'm going to write a legendary story.
He probably had like a Mary Jane shower sequence or something that you noticed and was like, no, that could not.
I was like, no, naked Mary Jane. And, you know.
You mentioned or you mentioned journalism is being worked into your Daredevil stories a lot. I wondered if you could, if you remember any specific examples of that you'd like to tell us about.
No, I think it was just this. You know, and that was one of the bonding things between me and Denny. We were both, you know, we had both done some work as reporters, and we had both wanted to be journalists, you know, and I mean, in some ways, a lot of people in comics back then. Now people aspire to be in comics. Back then, it was sort of like, you know, you couldn't get your paintings into a gallery, so you know, so for me, it was like, not only did nobody want my paintings, but I couldn't get a job as a journalist, you know, so it was, there were different times, you know. So mostly it was just that going out on the street and saying and seeing things. Like I remember going to a anti-nuke rally back when there used to be anti-nuke rallies, you know, when that's what the world worried about. And I thought, well, I have one of these big fights coming up. And, you know, I had this character, Bullet, and his son Lance was really paranoid about nuclear energy because that's what, when I was a kid, I was one of those kids where you'd be in like kindergarten and they'd make you dive under your table because supposedly, yeah, your desk is going to protect you from a nuclear, you know, whatever. So this kid was like living in a panic state. And so when I had Daredevil and Bullet fight, I just had them crash through the peace rally as a way of making a fairly lame anti-violence statement in a superhero fight by having them literally break through the peace rally banner. And, you know, so it was the kind of thing like that. And because John Romita would also see things, you know, like there was a character, he saw some dude on top of a car screaming or something, and he came in and he all excited and he was like, how about a character called Shotgun, and this is what he looks like, and that went right into the comic. So it was more about like just taking what was on the street, but then specifically things like the animal rights stories. That I did specific research into the farming industry about factory farming, and then would put so basically I wanted to be a journalist writing about things like factory farming, and when I couldn't do that, I found something much better. Just put it in a comic and bore everyone to death, you know.
Classic run. I mean, I was picking that stuff up as it was coming out, and just because I'd never seen a Daredevil comic like that, and it was so wild and so different than any other superhero comics. Coupled with the fact,
brilliant villains like the time Daredevil fought a vacuum cleaner.
I was gonna say that like I think the first ones I got was like that double-sized issue where like the mailboxes were coming to life and all of that shit had to fit into that.
For a new villain, a vacuum cleaner. How about Daredevil fights a vacuum cleaner? Okay, and then taking Daredevil to hell, which we only did because of John Romita Jr. Because John Romita Jr. was like rocking it. He's such an amazing artist, and when he showed us what he thought Mephisto would look like, we went, I don't know if you remember John Romita Jr.'s Mephisto, but it was brilliant.
Sure. Those issues when he goes to hell are some of the ones that are most vivid to me from that run, because they're so unexpected and unique and beautiful, and it kind of epitomizes a lot of that run for me, in that it is such a surprise from whatever my expectations were for Daredevil. Like I always remember him in snow and hell of Daredevil, like wandering through that snow and hiding out in a telephone booth. And it's like, I don't know, it was the perfect, what I wanted out of a comic, in a lot of ways, still what I want out of a comic.
The lines that Al Williamson would ink, just like all these obsessive parallel lines all over the place and textures, like that added to the mania of the visual part of it as well, man. Because
we had a lot of fun. And it's the team. It's the team. Ralph was a terrific editor. I mean, he knew exactly when to just reel me in a little bit. He never cared. He never cared that it was getting too, social justicey. He never cared about any of that. He was very good. It was the whole team, like with Karen now. I mean, Karen is the other comic I did is Ruby Falls. I can show you. I have both of them here. I can clog up the screen with one after the other. Is that working?
Oh, yeah.
Ruby Falls, and then Seeds. How do I do this? Seeds.
Yeah, it's
good. Yeah. Seeds, the collection is coming out next year, I believe. Is that right?
Yeah, it's all done. It's been done. But because of because of this.
Right.
You have your printer backups, you have your distribution backups, you've got a lot of, so now it's all done. I have the PDF right on my desktop here, but it's not coming out until December. So it's kind of sad because it's a very timely comic that is, it feels like it was futuristic and now it's in the past. Everybody's wearing masks, and it has nothing to do with, the plague. So, so we're really excited about the Seeds, and it's, but we have to wait another year before it can come out.
Were you paired up with an artist by Karen, or did you just naturally develop some collaboration with is that Flavia Biondi?
Flavia Biondi. So when I turned in the pitch for Ruby Falls, which is a 3-generation noir murder mystery, kind of about a fallen woman. What is a fallen woman? What does it mean to be a fallen woman? So Karen decided that she wanted it to be all female team. So I think it was Jeff Lemire had a project with Flavia Biondi that he wasn't ready to start it yet. And so she had a gap, and Karen sent me, and Flavia just like David Aja, completely changed the Seeds by his. There's so much telepathy that goes on in a really good collaboration, writer-artist collaboration. You're just like throwing each other ideas and images, and it becomes like this strange. I don't know. David brought his obsessions into the seeds, and so certain things got emphasized because he wanted to draw certain things. And it was the same with Flavia. She created this whole body language for each character that was just like the mother who's kind of repressed has always got her arms crossed. She's always in the shadows, and whereas characters that are a little more like there's a girl that works the silks in a strip club, and she's always like really balanced on her tightrope or in her silks. And Flavia did this whole, and then it bounces back to you. You're like, oh yeah, she really gets that the mother is repressed, and then so it's a little bit like music, where you're sending each other riffs, and the other person has to pick up on the riff that the artist is telling you something, that maybe they can't articulate, but they're telling you. This is, with David Aja, a lot of it was like sort of the Tarkovsky movie Stalker, that sensibility, and so you have to like listen to that and take the clues to what their obsessions are, so that it becomes a meld. Because honestly, comics, everyone believes that you have to be the writer and the artist. The best comics are the writer and the artist together. So there's always been this, when it's separate, do you have like that full vision of someone who's doing the writing and the artwork? No, you have something else. You have some kind of telepathic third monster that you create,
Do you get the opportunity to amend the words on the page after the you see what the penciler puts down on paper?
Oh yeah, I rewrite everything. I rewrite it all. I do full scripts. And like I think I was saying before, that with even my early Marvel work, I put all the dialogue in. And in superhero work, I would tend to, turn the fights over to the artist. I'd give them a couple things that could happen, but then I'd say, okay, you do this part, And so there are really tight, full scripts that I do. And then David Aja, for instance, he takes all the pieces and he juggles them. He juggles everything. And so then you have to rewrite. And that's the beauty of the process, really, because he's also writing, he's directing, he's like the editor and because having made films, you write a script and then you shoot it and then you see what you have and then you edit it, and so it's a fluid, collaborative process, and the artist has to be having fun. In my early days of writing, like poor Arthur Adams and Long Shot, it was like too many words, and it was probably like the most painful experience to cram all those little panels. And then, you get better at it, and then you're just like, it has to be fun for the artist. They have to be having a blast, because you can feel it. When a comic is tortured, you can feel it.
Is that something that you picked up from filmmaking, because you're, I guess, in the room with these collaborators, compared to comics where it's like send the script off to an artist that's wherever they are, but as a filmmaker, it's like actors and other technicians with you.
I also learned a lot. I taught film in Haiti for a long time, and so we had a film school in Haiti, and it was every day. It was like a writer's room. Every day my students would come in and pitch stories, and then we would go out and shoot them. And the great thing about working in Haiti is that we did this zero budget filmmaking. Like literally, if you couldn't get a car, see if you could get a donkey. And if you couldn't get a donkey, you get a bicycle, or wheelbarrow. I mean, everything was found filmmaking, like kind of like Rossellini, the early, the during the war years when they had no money and they would just use whatever, the town as the actor. Like we would look at movies like Black Orpheus, because Black Orpheus was, like a fiction shot inside a documentary, because it's just the town. So we would do fictions in a documentary setting. So if you wanted a cockfight in your, you wanted to do a film, we did a film about a cockfighter. We had to go to cockfighters and say, can we film a fiction film inside this documentary? Because the sets became free, the extras became free, there's no money in Haiti. And so I learned a lot making films in Haiti. I ended up writing a series called Gadoo Gadoo. Gadoo Gadoo is the way that Haitians say earthquake. So, you know, they had that big earthquake and they'd go like, where were you for Gadoo Gadoo? And they would do a little dance as to how like the earth shook and, you know, what they did. And so I write for this website, highlowbrow.com, and it's a great website. We do a lot of comic stuff. We did a whole series on Kirby, and I wrote about that experience. So yeah, it's what was your question? Filmmaking. Yeah, filmmaking is like comics filmmaking. It's part of the same, you know, all the ways to tell a story. And a lot of it is B-roll. When you're making films, you rely a lot on B-rolls. So you have like the main drama, the two characters talking to each other, but you're always looking for that little thing that's going on, you know, the chicken that's like scratching, and that's a way to show somebody's angry rather than having them say they're angry. So I try and do that a lot in comics where I say, you know, can we cut to a chicken scratching? And the artist goes, what the fuck? You know? And I say, well, I don't want them to say they're angry. I want the chicken to say it, you know? So it's that kind of juggling that's so much fun. And comics, of course, having that astoundingly difficult but amazing thing that it's the linguistics of words and pictures in one frame is like something we're all obsessed with and chasing, and it's very hard to get it right, even if you've done thousands of comics.
You know, you mentioned about not liking the fight scenes, right? Way back, say in the 80s, whenever, you know, your first go through of comics, going away from comics for a little bit of time, you know, in the 90s, and then coming back to them. Do you notice a lot of changes in the comics, you know, in Cartoonist and the language and the genres that are now sort of mainstream or much more prevalent now than they used to be? I mean, I don't know that fight scenes are obligatory anymore.
I don't look at that many comics anymore. I mean, I buy a ton of independent comics, but every once in a while, like I you know, these days, of course, we can't do it, but I will go into a comic shop, or especially comic conventions. You walk Artist Alley. I'm always looking for something good, and I buy a lot of indie stuff and just stuff that's just being put out by hand at comic conventions. But every once in a while, like I picked up The Vision by Tom King, and I thought, this is great. You know, he just took The Vision and said, what if he was in suburbia, you know, and had a vision bot wife and bot kids. And I thought, this is the kind of thing that superheroes should do more of, which is just, you know, take the superhero out of their normal, you know, it's like a roller coaster ride. You know what you're going to get. You know what you're going to get when you get a Batman story, a Wolverine story. You kind of know the ride before you even get on it. Well, I know Wolverine is going to get Berserker and he's going to, you know, do this and, you know, so you kind of, it's like a ride, you know, and it's comforting and you get on it and you run the loop. But why not surprise the readers and do the opposite? You know, why not? And so that's what I liked about The Vision, was that I didn't expect that.
Can you name some of the indie titles that you've picked up that are particularly noteworthy?
I'm completely in love with, I'm going to say her name wrong, Emile Ferris's My Favorite Thing is Monsters. And that blew me away. That completely blew me away, because it's like, to me, it was everything, you know, the outsider, the monster, you know, it hit me hard, that one. I'm not that great with remembering names, but, you know, of course, if you're talking superhero comics, I love how Ms. Marvel and Kelly Sue McConaughey with Captain Marvel and so G. Willow Wilson, I love how they're bringing females into the industry. I love how Devil Dinosaur, I think it's called, and Moon, you know, the Amy Reeder. I love how some of the young females, because, you know, people are always like, oh, you were like one of the early women in comics. But I don't think I did anything to help bring females into comics. Back then it was more like, can I write like a man? You know, I did Wolverine, Punisher, you know, I did all these tough comics. Did I ever pause to say Louise Simonson she was doing Power Pack, but I don't know that I particularly was doing much to help bring female readers in. And now the female talent are definitely making comics to bring female readers in. I have a lot of respect for that. I mean, one of my favorite people ever is Gary Panter. Gary Panter's work just blows me away. I mean, I can be all alone in a room, pick up the Gary Panter comic and be literally like on the floor laughing. You know, he's amazing. But you know, when I was the 80s, when I was in comics, it was the comics that were coming. I mean, you had Walt Simonson's Thor, which I loved. You had Howard Chaykin's American Flag, which blew me away. You had, you know, Frank Miller doing Daredevil. You had like, you had Kaluta Starstruck with Elaine Lee. You had the other stuff going on out there, like Harvey Picard and Mouse and Cerebus. Was that Dave Sims' comic? Mm-hmm. I forget. So, I mean, when I entered comics were exploding. And, you know, oops, sorry. And I don't know if, I don't really know if that kind of energy is out there anymore with superheroes. Because of the IP, because it's all too valuable. It's franchised, and, you know, the comics maybe have become places to just keep going to mine for movie content. I don't know, you know.
I think some of the first places I saw your name in the credits as writer was in the backups of Classic X-Men.
Oh yeah, they were fun.
And you worked with some. Yeah, John Bolton. You wrote the first Jim Lee X-Men story that is in the back of those comics.
A funny story about that is that, so I was at WonderCon and I had come back into comics in like 2014 or something to do, and it was not a good time in comics. It was like the New 52 at DC. And I really didn't know what was going on. It was like, so we're making all the characters young again as if they have no history. And I thought it was a good idea, but I didn't really know what I was doing. And Jim Lee interviewed me on stage. We did one of those stage interviews at WonderCon. And Jim Lee was like, well, remember that time we worked together? And I said, I never worked with you. And he said, yeah, we did a story together. I said, we did not, you know. And he went, we did a X-Men story. And I was like, And then he just turns and he pulls out of his bag the issue we did together. And I was like, I have no memory of that. And then I said, did you have a memory of that, or did your assistant, like, prepping you for this interview, dig that up? And he went, yeah, I didn't remember it either. So it was a very unmemorable story to the two of us. But then he signed his copy and gave it to me, and I read it that night in the hotel room, and I said, this isn't bad, you know.
Can you tell us a little bit about working with John Bolton on that stuff? Because he seemed to really there was a certain inspiration that as a reader, I feel he had while working with you, because Claremont wrote a bunch of the early ones, and the style was like John Bolton style. But when you guys started working together, like there's like a Mobius inspired strip that, and he changes the art there, a couple other places as well. So is there anything?
Well, I don't think, I mean, writers, we don't exist. We can't make comics on our own. You know, I draw, and in fact, I've been drawing a lot lately, thinking I'm finally going to write and draw my own comic, you know, because I already been doing thumbnails for years for the comics. So, you know, I'm like, I got to make, it's really scary. But in a sense, you know, we're nothing without, I can do journalism all by myself. I can do film all by myself. I can do theater all by, but I can't do a comic. And so you really have to look at what the artist, and John Bolton had a surreal mind. I mean, he was a goofball, and he was always like saying things that were like zingery in a very surrealist way. And I think it just became like, oh, I kind of get who this guy is. Let's do some surrealist stuff together. And then, I mean, and he's just such a doll. And then we went on to do Someplace Strange together, which is a graphic novel based on his family. It's his kids and his wife and him in it, you know. Yeah, it all comes from the artist, really. I mean, Art Adams loved monsters, and he used to send, it was either the fax machine or FedEx, because, you know, again, no internet. You know, he'd send like sheets and sheets of monsters. I'm pretty sure he sent in a woman with 6 arms, and I went, that one. And then, you know, it was sort of like, that's what he wanted to do, monsters, Gog and Magog. That's all out of Art's brain. And Arthur came up with all that stuff, you know, like he wanted the corner boxes in Long Shot Comic to have the monster keeps growing and growing and growing. You know, it was all his stuff. So you kind of like look at the work of the artists that you're working with, figure out who they are, talk to them if possible, you know, and then, you know, that's where those John stories came from, because he's an absurd guy.
And we're gonna have to have you come back on whenever you write and draw your
Yes.
first comic. I can't wait to see this.
Yeah, it will be quite hilarious because my artwork is strange.
I want to see these thumbnails. I want to see all of it. I want to see your paintings. I didn't know this part about your practice, that you did much art.
Yeah, well, I that's what I studied as an artist. I am a failed artist. I brought all my artwork around Manhattan. No one wanted it.
Have you continued producing visual art like throughout your comics career and journalism career?
Yeah. I'm always drawing. Yeah, I'm always drawing. And I'm rusty. My skills are rusty. Like when I sit down at the piano, I can no longer play the pieces I could play in my 30s. I'm back to playing pieces I played when I was 10 years old. And with art, it's similar. I just don't do it as much as I write. So I go to draw something, and I'm like, I used to be able to just, you know. So yeah, your skills rot. It's like a foreign language that you stop speaking it. So
we talked a little bit about how filmmaking influenced some of your storytelling and ideas of collaboration. Did journalism, you know, once you leave comics in the early 90s and you become a journalist for 2 decades, has that informed your storytelling in any way related to comics?
I mean, I think so, because it's about the atmosphere. So, for instance, I wrote this piece of journalism that maybe I'm the proudest of. I went to Baluchistan, and I went on a falcon hunt, and I wrote, it's crazy, with my film partner, Wendy Johnson. We went to Baluchistan, and we had like cameras, recorders, movie cameras, and I was recording and taping and shooting all at the same time, made 2 short films, and wrote 2 pieces of journalism in one trip. And that was kind of like my peak, the idea that you could just land boots on the ground in some place where you didn't understand the language. I mean, everybody was speaking Baloch. It's a province of, or Urdu. It's a province of Pakistan. We went on a falcon hunt with cutters from, or maybe you say Qatar, Saudi Arabians, Lebanese, and it was women, 2 women traveling with men that normally practice purdah and separation of the sexes. And so it was like this immersion experience. And I think I'm my happiest when I'm like completely bewildered and have to figure things out. So the same with Haiti. Haiti was just like, everyone speaks Creole. It's a whole wild, different culture. I did went to a lot of voodoo ceremonies, and I just like being outside my comfort zone. And I think that piece ended up being called The Most Dangerous Road Trip in the World. And then we also did a piece about the freedom fighters and the warlords in Baluchistan, and how we had to smuggle that footage out by pretending that we were working for National Geographic, making a movie about birds, So we always made sure our cameras had some bird footage in it, because we were making a movie about falcons. But then under that, there were all these tapes. We interviewed all the warlords in Baluchistan, and came back. So I don't know. I think I think that it's important to be out there in the world and live life, which is a horrible thing to say now that we're all quarantined, because how do you go out there now? So
the most, what was it, the most expensive road trip in the world, that was edited, that was in a book edited by Bourdain.
Yeah, he and in fact, when Karen brought him into comics, and we were at the New York Comic Con together, and it was Tony Bourdain and me and a bunch, it was like Karen's, the announcement of her lineup of books. And we were in the green room before, and Anthony said to me, I was so jealous. I wanted to do that story. He wanted to go on a falcon hunt in Baluchistan, because it's, it's about training falcons to kill, and then you eat the things, the hubara, which they kill. And he said that nobody would insure it, because it was like that was back when the Taliban were everywhere. I was in the Taliban country, so he couldn't get that trip insured by, I forget who, his CBS or whatever. And he said, CNN maybe, and he said, I was so jealous of you. And I thought, oh my God, you would have done such a better story. For one thing, his reputation would have shown a big light on the freedom fighters and what's going on there.
Did you know him back in the Marvel days? And I asked that because Chris Claremont would often talk about, you said you gotta feed Chris, and he would always say that whatever restaurant Bourdain worked at, like while Chris was doing X-Men and stuff in the 80s, like that was the lunch spot, man. He would talk about the Bourdain steaks and shit. So I think it was in close proximity to the office.
Yeah, I don't have a memory of that. Maybe Chris was leading me on Marvel's dime to places where Tony was the chef and I forgot. He might have been something he told me and I forgot. But yeah, I do know that he was a chef around town then. No, I didn't know him until he called me up asking for that Falcon story, and then met him again years later with through Karen.
Jim, what else you got, man?
That covers my notes.
Yeah, this is a super rich conversation, and thank you so much. Where can people find you nowadays online? Website information, social media. We're going to make sure to put these links in the description below the video.
Well, I mean, I write for highlowbrow.com, where you can see my Haiti stories, and I'm on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram under Annie Nocenti. And I have a website, annienocenti.com, but honestly, I haven't looked at it for 10 years. So I think it stops, you know, I think it looks like I died in 2012. But
Same deal.
I think that you can get this story Anthony Bourdain liked and see some of my films, but it really does look like I'm dead.
And what comic stuff do we have to look forward to? There's the collection coming out at the end of the year.
There's The Seeds. Ruby Falls came out this month, and it was very upsetting to put a comic out just as not only COVID but Black Lives Matter, because we did no press. Because it's just something about launching a personal comic when the world was falling apart. It felt like you were sucking the air out of anything, you know, more important things. So we just didn't do any press at all. I think I did one tiny thing, and it just didn't feel right to push your personal project when all this was going on. So Ruby Falls, probably no one bought it because no one even knew it came out.
Yeah, crazy year for sure. But these videos are gonna last a while, and retroactively, man, we're gonna send the Cartoonist Kayfabe audience on the quest to grab those books.
And now I'm on a quest to read your books.
At your own risk. Not only do I want to see your art, but I kind of am curious to check out your passport and see all the stamps. You know, I know Haiti. I know that other place in the middle. Yeah, I wasn't even going to attempt to try to say that.
China. The last place I went I did a TED Talk in Singapore, and that one you get the whole like, if you are caught with drugs, we will whip you. If you deal drugs, we will behead you. You know, I have that stamp.
God damn. Annie, thanks for coming by.
Thank you. Have a good day, everybody.